For one last time, the NFL exit report, 32 teams, 31 are done. We've saved the best for last, the Kansas City Chiefs, Super Bowl champs. And I'm joined, thankfully, by Chris Farley. We did one show together. We're going to do another one here to top it off. With head of betting for the 33rd team. How are you doing?
Oh, fantastic, Ron. Thanks for having me on again. And I must say, even though I probably don't have the depth of expertise I do about the Chiefs that I do about my Giants, they are a team that I championed most of the season because of the consistency we saw from them, right? So I'm excited to talk to you about the Super Bowl champs and what I think is probably finally, like we can say it, a dynasty in the making.
You mentioned consistency, and oh my goodness, 5 years of Mahomes and Andy Reid, and every year top 3, 4 in my power ratings. Every year, they're the team that you have to get by, and even when they lose on these really close games.
Yep.
I don't know. I mean, a lot of ebbs and flows in the NFL draft. One constant, Pat Mahomes, but I wasn't planning to start it this way, but it's kind of a quiz question. It's John Fox, Jeff Fisher, and Andy Reid are in a room together. Which one comes out alive? And it's got to be Andy Reid. He adapted with the times, and the other two guys around his generation didn't.
Oh my God, absolutely. I mean, you talk about. I think at this point, Bill Belichick, obviously almost 2 decades. Everyone's like, Bill is the man, like Bill's the genius. Everyone is kind of catching up to Bill, but I think it's Andy Reid now. And I think it's Andy Reid, obviously, because of what he's able to create offensively with the best quarterback in the NFL as well. And, that's a main talking point that I'm probably going to have a few times on the show with you, Ron, because I don't think there's any bigger advantage in football when you have a top tier coach who has a, high chemistry and just a great relationship with a top tier quarterback, right? Like that is a recipe for success. It's a recipe for wins. It's obviously a throwing league, a passing league now.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, Andy Reid has carved his way as probably the most creative play caller of our time. And I think he's also showing just as a leader of men, getting them ready and best prepared to win in the biggest games. Been doing it for a long time now, but he finally has the quarterback where I think we can see the best of what he offers on the field.
Yeah, it's interesting because the NFL is all about getting the smallest of edges, and that edge is worth a close win in the Super Bowl and close wins all the way through. We have to start about a year ago, not even quite a year ago, but Kansas City traded Tyreek Hill, and it changed the culture of this team a little bit. It changed the dynamic. They kind of knew what they were doing. Wide receivers can be pains at times to manage. I mean, Tyreek Hill is like a lot of wide receivers, a difficult personality, but they were going to lose his stretch the field capabilities. What were your feelings back when that trade was announced?
Yeah, I think Tyreek Hill is what everybody says he is, right? Like we see in the media all the time now, especially athletes being called great before they are great. But Tyreek Hill is great, and he's a difference maker with his speed. I mean, the guy is built like a 5'10" version of Brock Lesnar. He's a really tough guy to tackle. Always has been, and just that element that he brought to the Chiefs offense, a constant deep threat. At first, I was concerned that the Chiefs were going to lose that and that might affect their passing game a little bit. But at the same time, when you do see Patrick Mahomes and you see this offense move and how consistent that it has been over the years, I wasn't particularly concerned that it would necessarily keep them, from the playoffs or from being another Super Bowl contender. Maybe just a weakness that they would have to work through. And boy, Ron, I mean, they did that in very seamless fashion.
Yeah, it's interesting when you have Mahomes and his off-platform throws and so on. His vision is just so good. It's just refilling behind Tyreek, and I thought the draft did that. back-to-back great draft years. They had Nick Bolton the year before, who brought a tremendous amount of speed to the offense, to the defense. We talk about speed to the offense all the time, but it's also about speed in the defense. They draft McDuffie, I believe it is, in the first round. They actually drafted 4 cornerbacks, and as we saw late in the season, all 4 had to play meaningful snaps. I think it was 10 plus snaps for all of them, even in the Super Bowl and before that. There was a concussion that knocked out the previous draft choice, Snead, before that. So he adds these people, almost a throwaway pick. Now, we don't know it at the time, but Pacheco, I've studied the draft for 40 years, and I went back to my notes and I said, ran faster than expected at the combine. And I read something like that, strong as well. And we saw those things play out. It's just like all the pieces they put together in the draft. And I thought that as we were heading toward the fall and the preseason games and stuff like that, the roster was beginning to assemble, even in free agency, Juju Smith-Schuster and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the great thing about that quarterback coach tandem that I spoke about is they know exactly who they are, right? Like they know what their identity is, and they know what they want to do, and they know the types of players that they want to choose to give Patrick Mahomes and that offense the best shot at winning game to game. And they did a really good job. I mean, a player like Sky Moore, he didn't get as many opportunities this year as I think he's going to get in the future, but he could be a problem. I mean, that dude is hyper fast.
Yes.
It could be a real deep threat in the future. We saw him make a little bit of a difference on a few plays in the Super Bowl, but I think his stock is going to go up as the years go on because he's a Tyreek Hill like player with his speed. But when you lose somebody like Tyreek Hill, you usually need a few guys to make up for it, right? And I really like how they picked up Kadarius Toney mid-season. I think Kadarius Toney is like the closest, as far as like the profile of a build of a wide receiver that's similar to Tyreek Hill. Obviously, TBD on if it's going to be consistent with him and everything, and he's been injured a lot. But yeah, he's explosive. That's an explosive player, and I love that they picked up Isaiah Pacheco. Rutgers guy from South Jersey. I got some roots there, and I could tell you the school that he went to in Vineland in that area, that it's not soft. They breed tough athletes over there, and he kind of has that Ahmad Bradshaw like build. He's fast, but he's strong, small, but he can get around guys, and he really stepped up in the Super Bowl and in the playoffs. They were going to him more often than Jerick McKinnon. Roster construction is something that I don't think people talk about enough with the Chiefs, including on defense. They keep their veterans. They keep them happy too. They pay them. Guys like Willie Gay, Frank Clark, and Lord knows Chris Jones in the Super Bowl. They make big differences. So they have these key veterans that they can build around. And I would say too, right? You got a guy like Steve Spagnuolo who can coach up a lot of these guys. And that secondary, although really young, played really well at certain points, especially in the playoffs. L'Jarius Sneed, a really good player. Of course, he got concussed and then came back. But it's not their defense. The stats weren't always there in the season. It definitely had some games where you're like, oh, this defense might be a problem. But you saw growth throughout the season. And for whatever reason, Ron, whether it's Steve Spagnuolo, Andy Reid, a combination of a lot of things, their defense always tends to step up in those big game situations. And we saw that in the playoffs as well.
You mentioned roster construction. I think that's the key words there. Here's a team that knows that it's trying to get over the top every single year. They're right there. Yet they have one eye, maybe they have two eyes on the future because they're drafting these guys with an eye on the past, present, future, everything. And that's a separator for organizations. Only two keys for me for Kansas City, because you kind of know what they are year in and year out. So I didn't have too many keys on my team sheets. The two that you can speak to and any other keys that you had, the first one is, can the run game take some pressure off of Mahomes? Because I thought that was not happening in 2021. And I wanted to see more out of Edwards-Helaire. Instead, we saw less. What McKinnon would bring to the table. And luckily for them, it turned out Pacheco did contribute and help them. And in fact, they outrushed Philadelphia in the Super Bowl. And then I was worried looking at their early schedule. They were facing a lot of good quarterbacks. Of course, the entire AFC is filled with young, promising quarterbacks. And I was worried about cornerback play. And I put that in parentheses on the banner below because they lose Tyrann Mathieu, another one of those instinctive guys that would clean up for a mistake or two. With the current cornerback roster, including the rookie. Those were my keys as far as what would make a successful or unsuccessful season. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think those are really good keys. I mean, again, we're in this NFL era where even if the defense makes a few mistakes or doesn't always, hold their own, it almost doesn't matter, right? Like we saw that even in the Super Bowl, all they needed is a few stops in the second half, and Patrick Mahomes went down the field every single drive and scored. And so you really need them to be good, not great, in most situations in the regular season, and then you need to see growth throughout the season, and we saw that from their cornerback play. Patrick Mahomes certainly had time in the pocket for most of the year too. He was moving around really well. Even when he got injured, he was moving around really well. And we saw that offensive line, which Andy Reid has always emphasized, strong offensive line play is, obviously one of the tenets of success. We saw them step up and play better than the Eagles offensive line in the Super Bowl. An Eagles offensive line that, arguably is one of the most talented ever assembled. But the way that they're coached up before these games is fantastic. And they still have central pieces, again, right? Like a Creed Humphrey, for example, who's been there a while, and is as good as any center in the NFL. So I think they're really good at building around those pieces. And I was certainly concerned about their passing game. And I mean, Ron, it reared its head quite a few times, right? We saw close games against the Raiders, close games against the Chargers. Chargers played really well against them. Teams that maybe they should have took to the woodshed a little bit more. But at the end of the day, the way that they kind of like a Bill Belichick, right? Players play harder for the team that already has an identity, coached well. They have a leader that they trust, even when they don't entirely succeed in every game and every drive, because a guy like Patrick Mahomes and a coach like Andy Reid can save the day.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially 2021, but we saw it, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in 2022. They had to come from behind in a lot of games, and they just find a way to do that. Did you do anything with season wins, futures, divisions, anything with Kansas City at all?
I wish that I did. Was it at 11.5? I think it was.
It was up there, and I did nothing, for example, because
I didn't do anything with the Chiefs because I was one of those guys too who's like, well, this is a really tough schedule, right? So if there's any year where the Chiefs could stumble a little bit, obviously always in the AFC West, but just their level of opponents all season, then it could be the Chiefs, and they lose Tyreek. So I bought into that a little bit, but then you take a step back and you look, they lost 3 games all season, still don't know how they lost against the Colts in week 3. I think I mentioned that in almost every show I'm on these NFL shows, because I lost my Circa Survivor because of that play, albeit it wasn't a great spot for the Chiefs, but I can't believe they lost to the Colts. But to only lose 3 games with the schedule that they have, man, does that speak to not only their consistency, but when you have Mahomes, no game is out of sight.
They start 4-1. And at that point, I'm looking, because week 6 was a big week for me because I'm a big fan of early season revenge. All I kept saying in my Buffalo report was 13 seconds. Buffalo blew the game against Kansas City. They can't wait to get him. And then they do get Kansas City off a tough game. In fact, you mentioned the fact that they played the Raiders and it was 30-29 on a Monday Night Football. They have one less day to get over a divisional win. And then Buffalo's there. And still, that game was relatively close, I believe, right? Just a 4-point game.
Yeah.
So what were your impressions of Kansas City first 5-6 weeks of the year?
Yeah, well, that Buffalo game, I definitely, that was more about Buffalo to me, right? There's always going to be spots and situations in the NFL where a team's going to come in and the psychology behind it, they're just going to be maybe a little bit more fired up, even though it was at Arrowhead, right? So, I mean, that's a tough spot for the Bills even still, but they showed up, and they showed up big time. Through the first 6 weeks, it concerned me that they lost to the Colts. I didn't see that coming. Now the Colts, certainly on the defensive end still has some talent, but I mean, right away from the very beginning, Ron, I love the Chiefs in week 1 against the Cardinals, because I thought the Cardinals were going to be one of the worst defenses in the NFL. That turned out to be the case. But, you saw them play really close against the Chargers, really close against the Raiders. They showed up in Tampa Bay, but now we know that probably wasn't that impressive, right? So
Mhm.
I thought, even starting the season, they were 5-2, right, before they had a break.
Yeah.
That this was a team that they're going to get to the playoffs, but they're not going to have as elite of a season as they have in the past because of the talent that they have to face every single week. I mean, they didn't get a break, but the
I
fact
know.
that they showed up in one of the most impressive wins of the season for me. San Francisco was injured a little bit, especially on defense, but after Buffalo, they go to San Francisco and just demolish that team. And that speaks to how they can answer the call as well, right? So
Mhm.
um, just the culture alone in Kansas City, it's almost like even when you get down on them for a second, it's like you're fooling yourself.
It's kind of like a wagering teaching point right there. They lose to Buffalo. People could say, oh, they just lost to Buffalo. Now Buffalo's the top team.
Yeah.
But like you said, like we talked about, that was a situation that was more about Buffalo.
Yeah.
If you're reacting week to week in the NFL and you're wagering on these games, you got to take that out of the equation and look at the San Francisco game with McCaffrey just barely there at that particular point. So it's kind of a wagering teaching moment. So we get into, and they beat the Chargers a second time. It's another close game. I think the Chargers are so close in my mind to, I mean, nothing at that point really separated those two teams other than Mahomes, Reed, the will to win. I guess there's some coaching differences between Reed and
Yeah.
Staley, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
And then they have that 3-game road trip, and Kansas City, kind of has this habit of where they win, but they don't cover more than almost a lot of teams. They just find a way to win. They may not play their best, like you said, but they get through them. Let's put it that way.
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, no, the Chiefs are one of the main reasons, along with we talk about teams like the Bucks, the Rams, teams who have some of the best quarterbacks in the NFL perennially every year, and none of them were good against the spread. The Green Bay,
Yeah.
another one. And this was a season for that, where I think in general we just saw more parity in the NFL, just teams playing harder, a little more closer in talent. And but at the end of the day, it still exhibited that Patrick Mahomes, when you have an elite franchise quarterback, and especially the coach quarterback tandem, that's the difference maker. And that's usually going to be the difference maker in all these games. Although, I will say on that 3-game road trip that I see on the sliding bar there,
Yeah.
the Cincinnati Bengals are going to be the biggest threat for the Kansas City Chiefs for years to come, in my opinion, because Joe Burrow is very similar to Patrick Mahomes in just his mentality. He's a
Hmm.
winner. He's always been a winner. And I think the Bengals are going to catch the Chiefs, right? We saw, it was Brady versus Peyton Manning for years. That's kind of the new version of that, I think. And I do think
Yeah.
that's the only team in the biggest games who's going to be able to get the best of a team like the Kansas City Chiefs, because they have a guy who's equally as tenacious and talented.
Yeah, they built that team the right way, and we've seen the last 4 games pretty much flip a coin. I mean,
Right.
those were some of the great games in the NFL with Kansas City and Cincinnati facing each other. I'm going to give you a little sidetrack question now because it's been on my mind a little bit. We know that Kansas City survives all that. They do end up losing to Cincinnati in another tough game there,
Yeah.
but they go all the way through. But as they're ascending to the number 1 seed, something happens in the NFL that's unfortunate. We have the Damar Hamlin situation, and it strongly affects the players on the field, Cincinnati and Buffalo. And then the NFL, there was no right or wrong at that particular time. How do you assess the fact that 2 teams are most likely going to play just 16 games and Kansas City is going to play 17 games? Any thoughts just in general on that? I know it affected Kansas City it did affect Kansas City perhaps in a really positive way in terms of getting that number 1 seed, but awkward situation for the league. No right answer.
I don't think there is a right answer, and I think the league handled it as well as you could, right? If it was a situation where it was going to be Kansas City versus Buffalo, then they were going to play at a neutral site, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's probably the best way to go about it. We did see that affect the game against the Raiders. I mean, we instantly saw a lot of offense in that game, and then kind of tapered off towards the end. But yeah, no other thoughts other than I think you know of all the major sports leagues and the way that they're run and led. Um, the NFL, I do think they did the best they could at taking their time with that. Because if
Mhm.
you instantly reacted, like I remember working for the 33rd team during that week, and we're waiting is to hear about schedule changes and everything else, and it was like Thursday. It was like quite a few days after all that happened,
Yeah.
and we still didn't hear what was going to go on in that game, or what the result was going to be, as far as the way that was changed. I love the fact that they took their time. I love how the Bills and Bengals organizations handled that. That speaks really well to their leadership. And, the Chiefs, as much as they probably got an advantage from that, at the same time, I think they kind of used it as motivation too, right? Like if you're going to say
Mhm.
we're not supposed to be here, like we're maybe not the true number one, we'll just show you that we're the true number one. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what they did in the postseason again.
So at the end of the season, boy, my power ratings identified just about nothing. Buffalo, Cincinnati, KC, they were neck and neck within a half a point
Yeah.
of each other. And we knew KC only had to play 2 games, which that was the biggest advantage. The other teams had to play 3. But then we know what happened in Mahomes in the Jacksonville game, and his status. What were your thoughts, Kansas City heading into the playoffs? Any futures plays or anything you thought that they had an edge before that? And then what were your thoughts right after the Jacksonville game?
Yeah, I actually played on the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl after the Jacksonville win,
Okay.
because you're getting a little bit better value, especially following the fact that Mahomes was hobbling around a little bit. But I just there's a second gear to this team, and I talk about that in the NBA right now. Like you got 3 teams in the NBA: the Bucks, Celtics, and the Nuggets that have a second gear. And you don't have a lot of teams in the NFL who have a second gear,
Mhm.
But again, a lot of that is predicated on Patrick Mahomes and what he does. We know, but even as a team, you saw players. I mean, on the sideline, Chris Jones. They showed him in the Super Bowl on the sideline, uh, talking up his entire defense and stuff. They have leaders all over the field still. Willie Gay is another one of
Mhm.
them on defense, and it's just a team that has a great culture and they respond. And after I saw that win against Jacksonville, hard fought game, it was a tight game, but even though I knew that they were going to face Cincinnati, we're getting better value on the Chiefs now, right? So
Right.
it's always a lesson in the NFL is because it's so week to week. It's very easy to react, but to keep in mind the sum of its parts. I mean, 5 years, Patrick Mahomes has been the starter there. They've been to the AFC title game every single year. You know, it's just astounding what they did. And I watched back. I think it was in 2019 or 2020. I don't know, but it couldn't have been 2020 because then Brady went to
Mhm.
the Bucks. But when Brady was on the Patriots, it must have been 2018 when Mahomes was first in the AFC title game. Brady needed a lot of stuff to go his way to win that game in the AFC conference game, the championship game against the Chiefs 5 years ago, and
Yeah.
Patrick Mahomes' first full season as a quarterback. A lot of things to go their way. That game went into overtime. So I watched that game back, and then I made my bet, Ron, because I'm like, this is a
Mhm.
team still, as far as experience goes, from their leadership, their top players who have been there before, they're at a different level than even a team like the Cincinnati Bengals right now, right? The Bengals are going to get more dangerous the more experience they
Yeah.
get, but experience in big moments really matters to me, and no team has had more of that than the Kansas City Chiefs entering the playoffs, and I love the fact that I got a little bit better value on them.
Yeah. Fantastic points. And for Cincinnati, the game against the Rams in the Super Bowl was right there. The game against Kansas City in the AFC Championship was right there. Just one notch below what Kansas City is
Yeah.
bringing to the table right now, but talent-wise, right there. Speaking of talent, I think you had a stronger opinion than me on this, but when I was going through deciding what I was going to do and writing my articles about the Super Bowl, all my metrics said the line is correct. Philly
Yeah.
should be favored by point and a half. And I had some uncertainty with Hardman being in the game or not being in the game. I wanted extra weapons, so that Kelsey would. I guess Kelsey gets open no matter if there's no wide receivers on the field. But at the time, I was thinking, well, the more dangerous they could be in other spots, maybe Kelsey gets open and stuff. The best thing I could come up with is a high scoring game, but I couldn't pull the trigger on the game. What about you?
I did pull the trigger on the Chiefs, and I picked the money line. And of course, they went my way, so it's fun talking about it now. But, um, but I mean, I do think the line was right. I don't remember a team as talented as the Eagles on both sides of the ball in a very long time. The Eagles deserve to be power rated as high as it gets, right?
Right.
But the one thing that they were missing, and I ended up being wrong about this point, is the experience factor of Jalen Hurts on the other side, right? Because up until that game, I mean, they slept walk through a Giants game, right? And then in the NFC Championship game, obviously the San Francisco 49ers are on their fourth quarterback at one point. They don't have a
Yeah.
quarterback. So the difference in experience for someone like Jalen Hurts, like we can praise him all day, but the Super Bowl is way different. So I would rather bet on Patrick Mahomes in that sense, assuming that it was going to be a close game, that he was going to get the final score, make the final impact. And nobody likes the way the Super Bowl really ended, even though it was a
Yeah.
fantastic game. But ultimately that was the case. Now, the Kansas City, though, one thing that I was expecting is that offensive line was, I think that was the biggest concern, right? Because it wasn't as
Mhm.
built up as it has been in the past. You did have Creed Humphrey, but a lot of these other guys are younger players. Last season, right? All 4 out of 5 offensive linemen, I think, were brand new. So, not too much experience with this unit being together at the end of this season, but they kept, I mean, no sacks from the Philadelphia Eagles, right? Hassan Reddick was limited the entire game. I think he had 1 tackle the entire game and 0 sacks, 0 pressures, I believe. So again, it's like I don't want to talk about it too much, Ron, but when you've been in these spots before and you know what to expect, especially from the perspective of someone like Andy Reid, right? Andy Reid has been in the NFL atmosphere for 30 years. You know,
Yes.
that's a significant difference. As good as Nick Sirianni and his staff was, that's a huge difference as far as seeing different things. And it remains one of the greatest mysteries in football. How does Travis Kelce get 10 yards open from
Yeah.
everybody in the field? It's because the innovation from the Chiefs and Andy Reid is constant. It doesn't stop. He keeps on creating new ways to make things happen, and that's because he's seen it all. Like
Yeah.
he's gonna be able to reproduce some of that creativity and unique situations in ways that other coaches aren't. And Nick Sirianni might get there someday. But so I did play on the Chiefs. Very happy about that result, Ron. But you know what? That game, in all humility, could have went the opposite way. I mean, Jalen Hurts
Yeah.
played fantastic, and really in the second half, if they get one more score, are we having a different conversation here? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. The prevailing opinion was yes, Mahomes was going to be the difference. It was interesting to me. I couldn't pull the trigger on Kansas City. I had a different point about the offensive line, though. I thought Kansas City would use the disrespect card for their offensive line because it's top 3 in my books.
Yeah,
It wasn't even 4. It was actually all 5 offensive linemen were different in 2021. So it's just an incredible turnaround, great drafting, great free agent pickups, and so on. I like Hurts. Hurts, I think, thrived in the scheme that they had, and you saw it in the first half.
agree.
What made his lack of experience maybe less glaring is the fact that he's so comfortable with how Philly runs its offense. But the biggest thing happened in the second half, and that's why the banner says a tale of 2 halves. I don't think you can underestimate what Andy Reid, Eric Bieniemy, and Steve Spagnuolo did with that extended halftime show. They came out, they bottled up Hurts, they kept him in the pocket. He ran most of his yards, all but 4 of his yards, I think, in the first half.
Yep.
And then those scheme plays near the end zone, back-to-back touchdowns at the end of the game. I don't know what else to say. Maybe you could add something, but the way they adjusted in the second half was something in a big game that I haven't seen to this level in a long time.
Yeah, 100%. To put it in a different light, but to support what you're saying, Patrick Mahomes had 1 incompletion in the second half,
I
and it
didn't
was
know that.
it was a throwaway. So it's like it's not like he missed the pass or anything, right? He chose to throw it away.
Wow.
And what's really fascinating about the way they started that second half to me too is 3 straight running plays. I think it might have been 4 but quite a few yards on all those first running plays. You would have thought, right, like out of the half, here comes Patrick Mahomes, we're going to throw it downfield, we're going to, but they established their run game, right,
Yeah.
and they remained, at the end of the game, they were the better rushing team against what I would say most consider to be the best, most effective rushing team in the NFL, in the Philadelphia Eagles. Maybe they're not number one in all the stats, but when the Eagles needed to run in the past, they ran it, and they could not be stopped. But it was the Chiefs that I think it was a emphasis to, establish their dominance on that offensive front from the very beginning. That threw off Philly, I think, from the very start. And then, now we got to respect the run game on top of it, right? That's extremely hard to stop. They scored on every single possession. And that's all she wrote, right? And the Eagles, they there's not much that Jalen Hurts, there's not much that the Eagles did wrong, but in the second half they just weren't perfect, and they had to be perfect. They had to be perfect to beat the Chiefs in that second half, Ron. It was an incredible thing to see.
Yeah. So when everybody goes back and they start handicapping for the spring and the summer and the fall, it's these fine things, these little things that make a difference in the NFL, not just for gamblers' spread, but for these teams winning or losing a game and advancing to the next round. One play, one scheme change, one thing they find on tape or on film really makes a difference.
100%.
So here we are, it's March 3rd, and we're now talking about the continuation of what really is a dynasty.
Yeah.
And we've had two consecutive, I think, good to great replenished drafts by Kansas City. So they're going to implement, and now they're going to get all these guys back. Smith-Schuster, Hardman, Tony, Sky Moore. They're going to be even more indoctrinated into the offense. The offensive line is there. All those DBs are going to get there. But I have two questions still at this particular point that I would raise to you. For me, there's something about repeating that's hard in any sport. So how do they generate that same motivation where we want to get back? We missed on the Super Bowl. We lost barely to Cincinnati the year before. For Buffalo, the 13 seconds on Buffalo's side. How do they get to that same motivation and do this back to back? And then the AFC is just going to get better and better. I do believe the Chargers are going to be better. I think that Cincinnati, like you said, with all those guys still under rookie contracts, are not going away. I don't think Buffalo's going away. What's the separation for Kansas City? What's your early thoughts on Kansas City heading into next season?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think their schedule of opponents is going to grant them not an easy schedule, right? Because they're in the AFC West. They're still going to face, they got the Bengals on the schedule again next season.
Yeah.
That one's probably going to be at Arrowhead, though. But they got teams like the Lions, the Bears, Dolphins are a growing team, but it ain't quite as stacked against them as it was last season. Just because they have to face different divisions. So that's an advantage for the Chiefs right away. But I think as long as the Chargers have Brandon Staley, sorry to say, Chargers fans, that there is no excuse for, as talented as that defensive roster is for the Chargers, for them to be that underperforming on a regular basis. And I mean, that's supposed to be Brandon Staley's shtick. He's supposed to be a defensive guy. And he's just, I'm not seeing things maximized there. I'm not seeing game decisions being maximized. I love a lot of their talent on that team, but I don't think they can overcome the Chiefs. The Raiders, as long as they have Josh McDaniels, that's a huge question mark for me. Because I mean, look, the Raiders were the most volatile team in the NFL last year. They lost so many one-score games,
right?
Kind of the opposite of the Vikings, right? And they blew a lot of leads. But if they get Aaron Rodgers, we'll see, right? They become a little more formidable. And I do think that Sean Payton is going to be a problem for the Chiefs in Denver. I do think Sean Payton is a top 5 coach in the NFL when he was coaching. He creates a culture. And, if anybody's going to humble Russell Wilson, it's going to be a coach like that. And, Russell Wilson has always been a humble guy, but, we're just hearing things now about what's happening or what happened in that Denver organization last season. And it's just a little weird. I think he had a little too much lateral control there. Like do whatever he wants, right? Off the field and on the field. But as I said, I think the Bengals are the biggest threat. I think the Bills. I love the Bills. Who doesn't love the Bills? But it's a little too much about Josh Allen still, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Sean McDermott and their staff have the uh, creative and like innovative ability with the roster that they have right now to be better. They need one or two more pieces for that offense, so that Josh Allen has to do a little bit less. But I think he's one of the most dynamic players in the league, obviously. But I don't know, Ron. You heard Patrick Mahomes at the parade. Everybody's like, we're doing it again. We're running it back again. This is a motivated team. They have added a lot of young players to their roster. Patrick Mahomes, he's the old guard in the AFC West at 27, 28, but he's not going anywhere for a long time. So, and like you spoke to, guys like Sky Moore, guys like Isaiah Pacheco, probably only going to get better coached on that team. And that's a scary thought.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on one of the points you made. In any one game, I truly believe the Chargers can beat the Chiefs.
Yeah.
The problem is the Chargers in any one game, due to coaching, can lose a game that they shouldn't lose, or 2 or 3 or games, whereas Kansas City's going to find a way to win. So they could split that series, and it still is going to go in the Chiefs' favor. And I think even with Buffalo, that if Josh Allen does too much, and those turnovers which crept up in 2022. So not maybe, but probably it's Kansas City and Cincinnati at the top, and another with 9 home games, another 11.5 win total, maybe even a 12 win total. I don't see the value, but I understand the longevity and the consistency that we started the show with. That's what's there.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see the value either per se, because right, like if Patrick Mahomes does eventually incur an injury that has him out a few games, I believe we will see the value that he brings to that team. Chad Henne stepped in and did well for them, in the past, but it's the separation of Patrick Mahomes compared to most quarterbacks is just an incredible disparity. But yeah, I think it's the Chiefs and then the Bengals, and that's what we're going to see for many years to come. I want to include the Bills in there, but I just think, they have a long way to go now on both sides of the ball a little bit, right? Leslie Frazier saying that he's going to take a year off. There's some things going on structurally that might affect them moving forward. I know they got some contracts to take care of too. So yeah, it looks like a very Chiefs Bengals thing to me. And I'll just say this because you spoke about the Chargers as well. I think sometimes, or for the most part, one of the most important parts of a successful NFL team, not necessarily covering ATS, but like winning ultimately and getting to the big dance, is players and how they respond to their leadership. Like, do they want to win for these guys? And I think there's very few regimes in the NFL that command that kind of respect. I think we saw from the Seahawks a little bit this year, right? That team wanted to win for Pete Carroll. That team wanted to win for Geno Smith. He has an influence, but there's so few coaches and leaders like a Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, who create that kind of culture where you don't want to let them down. You don't want to be Chris Jones, who gets a personal foul call against the Eagles and grants them a score. And so you see in those big games that they perform so well and so refined because it means so much to them because of how they respond to the leadership on their team. And there is no team who has better leadership than the Chiefs, as long as Andy Reid is there, especially. And I think you can count on one hand how many teams have that, Ron. It's not a lot.
Yeah, it's a sports thing. It's also a business thing. Well-run organizations, that's what gets them to the top. One final question before we close this out, and it's not necessarily about the Chiefs. Is there any team, Chris, that intrigues you or fascinates you that you can't wait to dig into for next season? Could be a bottom team. It could be a top team. Just any team off the top of your head that you think, and I won't hold you to it, but they're saying, boy, I can't wait to get in and see what they're about.
Yeah. This is probably going to be a lot of people's answers, but I want to see what the Miami Dolphins and the Jacksonville Jaguars do next year. Okay. Because I do think in one game, right, and that's what makes football so exciting, is it is just one game. You're not having a 7-game playoff round against the Chiefs. I think the Chiefs are going to win most of those if they had that. But I do believe that Trevor Lawrence and what he showed at the end of that season, passing decisions, obviously passing skill, he can move with his legs, decision making, just comfort, right? Confidence in himself because of Doug Peterson. I think, and the results of that relationship is exciting. And they have a lot of young players on that team, Ron. I mean, especially on defense, we saw crazy, like really talented, hyper athletic plays made throughout the whole season by their defense. If they can just bottle all that up and like know when to do it on a more disciplined basis, that could be a really good defense, I think. So the Jacksonville Jaguars are a growing team. Mike McDaniel has some moxie and creativity that's really
Yes, he
interesting.
does.
And I think if they stay healthy or maybe even make a change at quarterback to somebody a little more dynamic than Tua, we'll see. I don't know if that's in their plans, but those are two teams that could be the little brothers of a team like the Kansas City Chiefs. Like that's who they want to be someday. But those are often those teams that dethrone, the teams at the top in like crazy games, when things happen. We've seen it before. So I'm really interested in those teams that played well this season, made the playoffs, and we'll see what they do and how well they can contend in the AFC, because the AFC just, many people thought that the NFC was better this year, Ron, but at the end of the year, it's like, I think the AFC is still far, far and
Yeah,
wide above the
top to
NFC.
bottom. Yeah, interesting. Your two teams are both AFC teams. And,
Yeah.
and I have to admit, I have some fascination with Miami's head coach. He just intrigues me, every conference and so on. I'm a glutton for punishment.
Yeah.
I can't wait to get my deep dive fascination is going to be with the NFC South. No winning teams last year.
Yeah.
But boy, if I can somehow separate those, there may be something in there. I'm going to take those four teams and see if something can be made out of them.
Yeah. How about the way the Dolphins fought in that playoff game against the Bills? I mean, that was
That's
impressive.
true.
Very impressive.
Three good games against the Bills.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it's a matchup team to team, and
Yeah.
that was an excellent effort by the Dolphins. No question about it. Chris, I want to thank you so much for giving your time. I know you're busy with other sports and you're very busy putting out enormous amounts of content with the 33rd team. I have a feeling you guys are going to be very invested in the draft. Of course, I'm going to be holed up in a bunker getting ready for the draft as we go through March and reemerge in April with a lot of thoughts and opinions, and maybe we'll share them together and so on. Thanks so much for doing this. And thank you for everybody who endured these 32 teams that we covered in the NFL Exit Report. Always good to look back, look ahead, and really assess what's going on. Don't wait till September 1st because the season will be there. But we get a little break right now. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Chris, again. And that concludes today's Exit Report.